Welcome to the third lecture in our series Introducing Psychology. Today's focus will be on the theoretical approaches of psychology, and I am, of course, Chris Gall, and I wrote the lecture and the slides. And the information within here is stolen from various sources as noted. So today's learning target is brought to you by the letters C and B, that is to say the College Board, is that by the end of the lecture you'll be able to both describe and compare different theoretical approaches to explaining behavior. Each of the approaches in this slideshow should end up with its own flashcard or its own entry in your self-created study guide for the AP exam in May. So as you're watching, if you need to pause it, if you need to stop and rewind it, please do those things. So I should lead this slide with a thank you to Lohman Learning, from whom I stole the information that I'm presenting. So to provide some more depth to what I introduced previously, on this slide, we're going to talk about two of the earliest theories of what can be considered psychology proper. As we do, be sure to compare the two and see how they're related, but also how they're each unique. Structuralism was focused, as the name implies, on the structures of the brain and their underlying characteristics. It was developed by Wilhelm Wundt in his laboratory in Germany. In essence, what Wundt did was to train observers and then subject them to specific stimuli. The use of trained observers was done to help offset criticisms that one cannot truly know what is being perceived or experienced by the mind. Wundt used repeatable stimuli in order to try to standardize his results. But even with these controls, he found that the experiments were highly subjective, and it fell out of favor with the death of his American student Edward Titchener. Functionalism is an outgrowth of structuralism, but instead focuses on how the brain functions as a whole. The ultimate goal is to establish evolutionary reasons why certain behaviors may be occurring. It relies heavily on Darwin's theory of evolution, and specifically the idea of natural selection and its explanation for why people act the way that they do and how those behaviors help them to adapt to their specific environment. The major theorist associated with functionalism was the American psychologist William James. Similar to Wundt, James used introspection as a way to help understand the function of certain behaviors. But in addition to that, he also relied on the more objective methods of collecting data, like recording devices and examining the concrete products of mental activities, along with the anatomy and physiology of the brain. Both behavioralism and Gestalt can come as a reaction to structuralism and as a rebuke to it in various ways. We'll talk about each separately and then how they relate to structuralism. Behavioralism, in its earliest forms, ignored internal processes because they were neither measurable nor observable. Behaviorists felt that if psychology was going to be a science, then like other sciences, it needed to be able to produce data that were reliable and valid and that could be replicated in a lab. Things that cannot be measured, according to them, play no role in psychology as a science. The earliest behaviorists worked to train animals to respond to stimuli. For example, Pavlov teaching dogs to drool to a bell. Anyone can do that with enough patience. Skinner taught birds to peck a key and rats to run a maze quickly. These are things that can be measured: how much the dogs drool, whether or not the pigeons hit the button, how fast the rats run the maze. We'll talk more in depth about this when we talk about learning, but for now you get the major ideas. Gestalt is more easily seen when we talk about sensation and perception. It's your mind's tendency to fill in the blanks. For example, if you watch a movie, you're actually seeing a series of still pictures that are rapidly being changed to create the perception of movement. Flip books work on the same principle. The whole point of Gestalt psychology is that it is not a single action or thought, for that matter, that is inherently important. Instead, it is the role that action or thought plays in the whole system. It's not the individual letters that I write that are important, but instead how I organize them into a lecture that matters. That's Gestalt psychology. We'll go into it a lot more when we talk about sensation and perception, and I'll show you some visuals that help illustrate some of the key points. Behaviorism is a reaction to the use of introspection, as I hinted above. Behaviorists, especially the early ones, had no use for how an individual thought. Famous quote by the behaviorist John B. Watson is that you could give him 10 kids, and through education and proper training, he could make any of them a wonderfully articulate lawyer, or the worst thief you ever met, or anywhere in between. Gestalt, on the other hand, is a reaction to the structuralist idea that we should focus only on individual structures in the mind, instead of focusing on the mind as a whole. Both represent significant gains on structuralism as a theory. I should pause long enough to mention that I stole the information on Gestalt psychology from Very Well Mind. It helped to clarify my thoughts and to nail down some of the specific ideas in my brain to be able to share them with you. Other early-ish approaches, and really we're well into the 20th century by this point, include psychoanalysis, which is also sometimes called psychodynamic theories, and humanism, and we'll talk about each in turn. In a nutshell, psychoanalysis focuses on the role that unconscious conflicts play in our actions and our lives. If you've ever heard people talk about the id, ego, and superego, they're talking about psychoanalytic theory. Basically, the id and the superego are in conflict, and the ego is the referee between the two that decides on some sort of socially appropriate choice. We'll go into more depth when we talk about personality theory on how this all plays out. When we talk about abnormal psychology and therapy, we'll spend some time talking about defense mechanisms and the role that they play in keeping our minds safe and relatively conflict-free, at least on a conscious level. Freud and his followers had, and have, all kinds of ideas for how to interpret what these conflicts might be and how they are playing out in our brains. If you've ever heard of Freudian dream analysis, stream of consciousness, or free association, those are ways of trying to understand what is going on in the unconscious mind. Unlike psychoanalysis, which spends all of its time trying to figure out what is wrong with you and then how to fix it, humanism instead focuses on what is right with you and how to build upon it. If you've ever heard of positive psychology, that falls squarely into the humanist camp. Humanism is also focused on you and your brain as an entire organism, with Abraham Maslow, for instance, talking about how if certain physical needs aren't met, like food and physical safety, it won't matter what else is going on. Those will be your focus. According to Maslow, it's only once those lower level, more basic needs are met that you can then seek to meet the higher level needs, like fitting in or finding a career that you like, what your role in society is, etc. In both cases, these represent a significant pivot away from behaviorism and its exclusive focus on things that are measurable and are instead a swing back toward structuralism and functionalism with their focus on thoughts and mental processes. Psychoanalysis more closely resembles structuralism and its focus on individual conflicts that need to be resolved. Humanism is more like functionalism and Gestalt in the sense that it looks at the entirety of your experience and not simply a specific subset of experiences. So the first approach on this slide is evolutionary psychology. And I know that evolution has a bad name and that some folks claim it's just a theory. It's worth pausing here for a moment and saying that while scientists call it a theory, well over 95% of all scientists believe it is valid, and that arguments about gaps in the theory really come down to evidence that is not yet found, not parts of the theory that have been disproven. They could be proven, or disproven for that matter, but have not yet been. Evolution still remains the best explanation for the biological diversity we see in the world today. So with that disclaimer in place, we're going to focus our talk specifically about natural selection. And natural selection is the idea that certain traits are selected for by species. In essence, they are selected one of two ways. They allow us to survive for longer in order to reach sexual maturity, and or they make it more likely that we will successfully mate and pass our DNA or ways of doing things on to the next generation. Evolutionary psychology has an advantage in that it can be used to explain both thought processes and ways of approaching things and our behavior, which is not something that any of the other approaches can claim. It's a powerful claim, and that's why we'll continue to be talking about evolution as we go throughout the course, specifically as it applies to psychology. A biological approach to psychology means that we are focusing specifically on the anatomy of how we think and perceive. So when we're talking about biology, we're talking about the various parts of the brain and the nervous system generally. We'll actually spend some time learning about the brain itself, its anatomy and how it functions, and we'll take a brief period of time to talk about the anatomy of nerves and the role that they play in sensation and perception, how they communicate, and the difference between sensory nerves and the ones in your brain. Focus is not on what we think, but instead on how we think. And in a biological approach, what happens when we are short various neurotransmitters or if the nerves do not function properly for some reason. We'll spend a lot of time talking about biology when we talk about development, as well as when we talk about abnormal psychology and treatments for abnormal psychology. Evolution as an approach focuses on why certain ways of thinking or being are still around. A biological approach is not concerned with the why, only with the how, as in how does it function and what happens if something malfunctions. You can think of biology in this sense as being akin to mechanics. Both of these incorporate both systems of thinking and individual units of thinking, aspects of both structuralism and functionalism. The focus on the function of the brain in the biological approach is similar to the behaviorist approach, a focus on what can be actively observed. We can observe nerves firing or the brain thinking by using technology to help us see it. I put cognitive psychology on its own slide for a few reasons. One, I had an odd number of approaches to talk about, so something was always going to be on its own. And two, it has a lot of overlap with some of the other approaches, and so will probably take a little longer to talk about. And three, it's the one you're most interested in, probably. Cognitive approaches focus on how the brain works, kind of like biological ones, but unlike biological approaches, cognitive ones are not focused on the specifics of anatomy, but rather on the outcomes. So it's not about how nerves fire together to talk to each other, but instead how that firing serves to create a memory, or why it won't create a long-term memory. Unlike evolutionary approaches to psychology, cognitive approaches don't actually care why we do certain things, but instead why we remember some things better than others. And why, even though we think we remember certain things, we are actually misremembering them. So it's really about how we interpret our experiences and how these interpretations are created and recreated every time we think about an event, how our current or former emotional states can influence those memories. So, unlike psychoanalysis, which focuses on the unconscious, cognitive approaches are very conscious. When we try to remember something, we know if we can and understand the impact if we can't. With that being said, certain of the defense mechanisms that talked about in psychoanalysis impact how well we may remember a certain event and why, or at least attempt to explain it. With its narrow approach on thinking about learning, cognitive approaches share very little with humanism or even less with behavioral approaches to psychology. There are some ways we can find some similarities with those earliest two approaches, structuralism and functionalism, but only superficially. The focus on both individual parts, as in parts of the brain or specific memories, can be likened to the emphasis on specific structures found in structuralism, but that's the biggest area of overlap. The emphasis on how the brain remembers things as a process can be likened to functionalism's emphasis on how the brain itself functions. But again, that's the biggest area of overlap. As we go throughout the course, we'll learn a lot of things related to cognitive psychology, and hopefully you're already starting to look into it, as cognitive psychology is what helps you be a better student. I'll definitely be talking about it a lot as we go on. So, in some ways, it's very easy to see connections between sociocultural approaches and biopsychosocial approaches. After all, the latter incorporates the former. But the biopsychosocial approach is an interdisciplinary approach to studying behavior and mental processes, where a sociocultural approach sticks exclusively to the roles of situations and cultures. We'll be using the biopsychosocial approach as we go throughout the course, both by examining its separate aspects, but also by examining the roles in conjunction with each other. The sociocultural approach will be its own unit of study. Indeed, after cognitive, it's the one that most people are familiar with. And if we're talking about experimental psychology, it's the one that Hollywood loves the best. Sociocultural questions include things like how peer pressure can get you to do things that you would never dream of doing on your own, or the role of the audience in sports performance. It's good stuff and genuinely interesting. If you want to peek ahead, you can find videos about the Stanford prison experiment on Netflix for sure, but I think there are videos on YouTube too, though perhaps not Hollywood quality, or the Milgram obedience experiences. This one I did actually find on YouTube. Biopsychosocial approaches can be used, for example, to answer questions like, what drove Adam Lanza to shoot up Sandy Hook Elementary School? And please note that I'm not saying all school shooters are mentally ill, nor that their behavior should be excused. As a school teacher, I'm appalled by the idea that I may one day have to put my body between a shooter and my students. But it is worth asking the question, what role did Lanza's clear psychological concerns, his mental illness, biological concerns, the way his brain had developed differently under the influence of his autism and his specific circumstances, and the role of sociocultural influences like the violent video games that he enjoyed playing, play in his ultimate decision to kill his mother and shoot up an elementary school to which he had no ties. Also worth saying again for the folks in the back that I do not believe people who are mentally ill or those who have autism are inherently violent, or even that I believe that having one or both of those conditions would cause someone to act out in violent ways. Simply put, I think the question worth posing, if intervening and helping earlier can prevent the pain caused by Adam Lanza's choices from occurring again. So let's take a quick moment to review our success criteria, which are based on the learning target presented at the beginning of the video. By this point, you should be able to identify and define or describe 11 different psychological approaches, most of which we will visit in more detail later in the course. Structuralism and functionalism are the two exceptions to that. We won't be going back to those. Then, using those definitions, you should be able to compare approaches so that you can begin to identify strengths and weaknesses to each approach. If you cannot do those things, now would be a good time to go back and rewatch all or part of the video in order to pick up what you missed. It's been a pleasure being your host for this video, and I will see you again next time. Until then, au revoir, and I hope you stay well.